kudos for scheduling this week when the forms and mechanisms by which we have international agreements to deal with things that glow in the dark is so in the news. That's the issue. Obviously, not merely with this particular bill and the reprocessing issues, but of course it's about the JCPOA. And before I get into anything else, let me just say the big and obvious thing of why we care about this, since I don't think it has been stated, is that if Iran ends up getting a nuclear weapon, then it's going to be in Saudi's interest to do that too. And Saudi Arabia has said so very explicitly that if and when Iran acquires a nuclear weapon, they will follow suit as soon as possible. Now, I'm not going to take a position on the relative desirability of the gold standard as opposed to a normal 123 agreement with a country like Saudi Arabia. There's some fine arguments for a categorical commitment to nonproliferation, but there's also some good security and alliance arguments for a standard 123 agreement, or at least making sure that some kind of agreement is executed. The complexity of the Saudi relationship and the expectation of asking more of the Saudis than we ask of Iran makes some of that difficult. And again, just to state the obvious question, with the getting rid of the JCPOA this week, I think that creates a lot of uncertainty. And until we know what the U.S. policy is with respect to Iran broadly, it's going to make some of this a little bit difficult. Instead, I'm going to talk about competing institutional claims and I would say an especially congressional phenomenon about constitutional talk or constitutional arguments about the mechanisms for concluding these agreements. In particular, try to disabuse some of that. To give you my bottom line up front, I would just urge that this is a policy issue about whether to amend or not amend the 1978 law. Asking whether Congress has ample authority to do so is the wrong question. So I completely agree with Greg about that. Probably disagree on the unconstitutionality or the possible unconstitutionality of them. But I think that folks on both sides of this debate, and that means congressional staff, would do a big favor to themselves and to the dignity of argument by focusing on the merits and not muddy the waters with allegations of constitutional impropriety. On the one hand, Congress has authority to do such things under its Foreign Commerce Clause, but on the other hand, and you heard this from Representative Ross-Leighton, in her words, she saw it as a national security issue. Regardless, Congress can and does pass legislation like this. It's always available to the executive branch to push back. That's the way it's supposed to work. The Constitution itself is an invitation to struggle for the privilege of directing American foreign policy. And so whatever the allegations are about constitutional impropriety one way or the other, I think that tends to be kind of a shortcut for the real work of slugging it out every day in terms of policy and politics. But that doesn't mean it's not fun. And heated accusations of executive agreement overreach are usually better understood as a kind of a proxy for whatever the policy issue is. Greg, you mentioned the Pacificus Helvetius debates from the 1790s. Wow, I'm impressed. And that, of course, was also a surrounding and had enormous consequence, but it was also about the very real question of what exactly we were going to do with respect to neutrality in the war with France. But my bottom line is bringing constitutional cudgels to a policy fight can sometimes cloud the issue too much. The other big thing that's going on here in terms of how people tend to talk about these things is it's not just about Congress versus the executive branch. But of course, and that's a big one in this particular case, but the other big one that frequently comes up, and we heard it a lot this week, is the executive branch versus the Senate in its treaty-making capacity. That's the other claim here that is sometimes thrown around is Congress shouldn't be mucking around on these high matters of state with respect to other states. Perhaps the other body on the other side of the hill should be doing that. You heard that this week with some tut-tutting and clucking that the JCPOA would have perhaps been not so easy to cancel if it had been a treaty, which is possibly true, but I think a little misleading. Had it, for instance, been a congressional executive agreement, more bipartisanship might have attached, And that alone might have saved it. But presidents can also withdraw from those. And President Trump, as we've heard in the past few months, has talked about getting rid of NAFTA. And President Bush withdrew from the ABM treaty. Presidents have that authority. And so it's not the form of the agreement alone that contributes to that. It's a lot of other things as well. But these kind of allegations recur all the time. Like signing statements and executive orders, which are their domestic cousins, non-treaty executive agreements have long been favorite whipping boys in terms of this policy discussion. So, although they're sometimes said to be constitutionally suspect, they in fact represent a critical instrument in our constitutional framework. They've been used since 1792, and the vast majority of international agreements that relate to diplomacy are either congressional or sole executive agreements. There's also a couple other categories. Of course, there's treaties. There's also treaties that are not ratified, that are sort of sitting there that we have to observe in their object and purpose. There's agreements made pursuant to a treaty, and there are non-binding arrangements, like the JCPOA was. It's not a legally binding agreement. I would point out to those that were saying it should have been submitted to the Senate, and that therefore it would have lasted. Never in the history of the U.S. Senate has the Senate ever given its advice and consent to an instrument that is not binding or intended to be binding to law of nations or international law. Why? Because the resolution of ratification is all about giving advice and consent to ratification, which is a thing that says we're agreeing to be bound by this legally, not as a political thing. So just within this category of relating to, let's just say, arms control, sole executive agreements like the Rush-Bagot Treaty of 1817, regulating the strategic weapons of the day, Navy warships, statutory agreements like 123 agreements, the India Accord, and also, by the way, SALT I. In terms of non-binding arrangements, we have the presidential nuclear initiatives from the 1990s, missile technology control regime, the 1994 agreed framework with North Korea, the Budapest Agreement, and on and on and on. Lots of them. There's a trade. Those agreements which are easier to make are perhaps easier to get rid of. But as I say, executive agreements have long been a favorite boogeyman to allege presidential overreach. In the 1840s and 1890s, senators wondered how Texas and Hawaii could be annexed by a joint resolution of Congress after treaties for the same had been rejected. Theodore Roosevelt circumvented the Senate by numerous arrangements in the Far East and with the Caribbean powers, and the Senate didn't like it very much. In the 1940s, partisans of the Senate squared off with FDR's high-flying prerogative men how Yalta and the Potsdam post-war agreements could be made. And in the 1950s, we very nearly amended the Constitution with the Burker Amendment to try to foreclose non-treaty agreements of this kind. More recently, in the 1970s, members of Congress went to war with what they perceived to be an imperial presidency, with executive agreements being one of its chief marks. And similar debates kind of percolated around in the 80s and 90s, but were a little more subsided. I want to give you a couple more recent examples. In 2007, the Bush administration arranged a status of forces agreement with Iraq, but it was controversial. And you had folks like, well, all three Democratic candidates for president, Senators Obama, Clinton, and Edwards, objecting on constitutional grounds that this was a violation. James Madison would have been offended. None of those same opponents objected, however, when President Obama conducted a SOFA agreement on his own authority with Afghanistan just a couple years later. And that, in some ways, is the pattern, right? The Constitution being trotted out, constitutional improprieties alleged, when what it really is a proxy for this policy issue. Now, there are heavy and practical reasons why either Senate review for big arms control treaties is a good idea. It is, I believe that. It's called the Biden-Helms criteria. In 2002, came together and said, we want the Moscow Treaty, we want it submitted to us, the Senate, rather than being done by you alone, President Bush. But I don't believe, and I think the arguments are so frequently clouded when we allege constitutional impropriety. There may likewise be good policy reasons to revisit the 1978 Act. Perhaps some kind of combination of a fast-tracking arrangement to make sure it gets an up and down vote and doesn't linger in Congress, as did the free trade agreement with South Korea a few years ago. But please be careful for alleging the Constitution requires this or that approach. There's no nuclear weapons clause or nuclear materials clause waiting to be discovered in the margins of the Constitution or some musty documents from the 1790s. Look at these as matters of policy. That's what they are. Everybody really knows that. And help improve the debate by not recurring to these kinds of things. Thank you.